We'll now hear from Professor McCarthy.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here. I think it's a very interesting idea, this idea of the people hearing, listening, thinking, asking questions, and coming up with decisions representing the people in general, and particularly on such a difficult area as the Constitution, and particularly on the issue we're discussing today. The Chief Justice started by talking about the complicated path of how we got here. I'm going to be dealing with possibly one of the most complicated parts of the consequences of how we got here. The Protection of Life during Pregnancy Act 2013 was the first time that termination of pregnancy was allowed in this country on the basis of suicidal intent. In other words, a belief, an understanding that a woman just wasn't thinking of committing suicide, but that there was a real and substantial risk that the woman would kill herself in pregnancy unless she had a termination. This piece of the legislation refers in reality to a very tiny group of women. And I'm going to start by saying why it applies to such a tiny group of women, before actually dealing with the actual procedures involved. So the first condition is that the woman has a pregnancy that she does not want. As you may or may not know, approximately 50% of pregnancies are planned, 50% are unplanned. And of the unplanned, that does not mean they're unwanted. Many are wanted. It may be a shock that they're pregnant or it was unplanned, but either immediately or with time, she or both will be delighted, and in the end will have a baby who will be one of the most meaningful, joyful, important people in their life, and it will all end in that way, which is wonderful. The reality is, though, that pregnancy is not like that for everyone, and for a lot of women with unplanned pregnancy, it is an unwanted event. And that unwanted event may or may not cause them depression, distress, trauma, shock, etc. But the vast majority of women in Ireland who have unwanted crisis pregnancies are not suicidal and are not saying they're suicidal. They may just decide to have a termination of pregnancy. The reasons that they are pregnant can be varied, of course, but it's an unwanted pregnancy. And as a result of that, they will travel to the UK or elsewhere to have the termination of pregnancy. Thousands do this every year. Or they will order tablets over the internet or access tablets to try and induce a medical abortion themselves. That's a reality. That's not psychiatry. That's not suicide or anything of the sort. A lot of women are depressed in pregnancy. There's an illusion sometimes. There's a thing called postnatal depression that everybody knows about. The reality is depression is very prevalent in pregnancy as well. It's estimated that somewhere between 11 and 13% of women will be depressed in pregnancy. We could be here all day discussing what does depression mean. Every one of us in our lives, if we've any experience of life of being depressed, we're all depressed sometimes, either depressed. It's a normal part of human reaction. When disappointing things happen in relationships, in our work, in our life situations, after bereavements, traumas, sometimes just depressed about ourselves, disappointed with ourselves, part of the normal life journey. But sometimes that depression is much more severe, much more serious, and sometimes becomes unmanageable, and sometimes, particularly if that occurs in pregnancy, can be a profoundly challenging experience for any woman. However, the vast majority of women in pregnancy who are depressed are not suicidal. They may have suicidal. The word suicidal ideation flies around all over the place. A lot of people have suicidal ideation. A lot of people wake up in the morning thinking, I don't want to wake up today, I'd rather be dead. That's a passing thought. People can have suicidal ideation of a more severe nature in pregnancy as well, where they are haunted, if they're profoundly depressed, by suicidal ideas coming into their mind, images constantly of dying, imagining themselves jumping over a cliff or driving into a wall or whatever. The vast majority of women who are depressed in pregnancy do not want to die. The vast majority of women in pregnancy who have suicidal ideation do not want to die. The vast majority of them want help with their depression. And the vast majority of them are not thinking that they want a termination of pregnancy. pregnancy may or may not be a small part of it. It may be the trigger, but it's not necessarily they're thinking, oh, but if I have a termination, I'm going to be okay. So this law states that the woman firstly has to have an unwanted pregnancy, secondly has to be depressed, third wants a termination of pregnancy, and fourth thinks that if she has that termination of pregnancy, that will be the cure for her. That will at least alleviate her depression. And it's only in those circumstances that the legislation begins to apply. So if she feels that, then she will present herself to a psychiatrist. Now, how she gets there is a question. She may present to a crisis pregnancy unit, to her general practitioner, to an emergency department, to an obstetric hospital, but she'll present. And she has to be assessed first by a consultant psychiatrist, not by any junior psychiatrist. And actually accessing a consultant psychiatrist is not necessarily the easiest thing in any emergency. And that psychiatrist then has to assess her to be sure, not to be sure, but to assess whether all these criteria have been fulfilled and whether this woman really does want a termination of pregnancy and whether she is so depressed in herself she's lost the capacity to make the decision or not, or does have the capacity to make that decision. Is it likely to be an ongoing thought? Is it a transitory thought? Is she just having suicidal thoughts? She could even be rarely psychotic, have a voice in her head telling her to kill herself, in which she needs psychiatric treatment, not a termination. In other words, make a comprehensive psychiatric assessment, making sure that her decisions are well thought through, because we have to be aware in making the decisions that the termination may, yes, protect her life. It may also be harming for her. We know that some women are damaged by terminations of pregnancy. And there's a lot of research on the psychological consequences of termination, which obviously in this space I don't have time to discuss. If that psychiatrist is of the view that yes, she fulfills these criteria, yes, she's profoundly depressed, yes, she wants a termination of pregnancy, yes, that is the only option for her, well then they will have to ask a second consultant psychiatrist to see her. And this psychiatrist has to have some experience in this area. That will not be easy, because there aren't too many psychiatrists who have that experience, and there aren't too many psychiatrists who want to be involved here, because this is very controversial. It's highly charged, it's highly politicized. So it's very difficult in getting a second psychiatrist. And if this woman is under the age of 18, if she's a child, technically under the Mental Health Act, somebody under the age of 18, it has to be a child and adolescent psychiatrist who'll see her. And they also have to agree that all of these criteria have been fulfilled. And if that's the assessment, they also have to then, of course, involve the obstetrician, who also has to agree that all of these criteria have been fulfilled. In the event of all three agreeing, well then she will go on to have a termination of pregnancy. The reality is, as I said, looking at all of those criteria that I've listed, this refers to a tiny number of women. And in my clinical experience and clinical experience of any psychiatrist working in a maternity hospital, almost my first question in a situation like that will be almost, why has she not gone abroad? Why would she put herself through this? Because if a woman is profoundly depressed and suicidal and distressed, to talk to one person, one consultant, one stranger about the circumstances of the pregnancy, their mental health, their personal story, what may be behind all of this, is itself a difficult experience. And of course, that consultant might not even have been the first person. They might have presented to their general practitioner, to crisis pregnancy agency, to a junior doctor first. So to begin to tell that story to one psychiatrist, to try and tell it to a second psychiatrist, another stranger, and have to wait. It could be waiting a few days, it could be waiting a few weeks to get a second consultant to see them. And then know that she might be turned down. And that if it is turned down, then she will have to go to an appeals panel. And it's great there's an appeals panel there. That's an appeals panel where she'd have to talk to two more psychiatrists and a second obstetrician, possibly two obstetricians the first time, two obstetricians the second time. Why would she put herself through that? And the circumstances of herself putting herself through that are likely to be relatively uncommon, relatively rare. Of course, it may apply to those who, for some reason, can't leave the country, maybe because of their visa issues, they're refugees. It may be someone who's in care, a child in care. It may be somebody with learning disability. These are all rare possibilities, but it's a very small number of women who, looking at this, knowing this, will actually want to go through it. I remember when this legislation was being drafted, there were sort of beliefs somehow that women all over the place would be presenting psychiatrists, saying they're all suicidal and fooling psychiatrists, and there were people talking about their reading, that young women will be looking at books on the internet and how to fool psychiatrists and presenting in this way. That simply has not happened. It was never likely to happen. Because, and as you know from the figures, we've had 3 terminations last year under this Act, 3 the year before. There have only been 2 appeals in the over 2 years as well. One of those appeals went on to be one of those 6. One appeal was turned down. So 7 women have presented to be assessed just over a 2-year period. Out of the in 3 years, 180,000 women plus who've been pregnant in Ireland. And if we take 13% of those being depressed, that's a lot of women who are depressed in pregnancy who've never gone near this situation. So that's who it's referring to. And as I said, the appeals group will again be 2 consultant psychiatrists who will again have to see the woman, take her history, assess and evaluate, and another obstetrician. So I suppose the last point to make is just for you to be aware, suicide does occur in pregnancy. I am on the confidential inquiry into maternal deaths in Ireland and Britain, have been for the last 8 years. So I see, unfortunately, read the case notes, read the histories from general practitioners, from the obstetricians, from the psychiatrists, of women who have killed themselves in pregnancy. It's rare. We'd expect one in Ireland approximately every 4 years on the statistics. But it may be more common than that because suicide is always underestimated. And we know that some case where somebody might drive into a tree or drive into a wall that appears to be a road traffic accident is sometimes suicide. But it still is a very, very small number. But it does happen. It is real. And when it happens, it's always a tragedy. And of course, we will see not just that the mother has died, but also her unborn child or children. And sometimes leaving behind other children as well. So it's real, it's a tragedy, it's substantial. But that's how the Act works in that small percentage of women who eventually will present to the maternity hospital or their GP or psychiatry in this way. Thank you.